Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Michael Sisco show. I did a terrible job of promoting this episode, so I apologize, Professor. Normally, I get a flyer out um, earlier in the day. I didn't really promote until like 30 minutes beforehand, but I had a long day stuck in traffic on the way back from Virginia today. But thank you for coming on the show. I know it's been a while, and we are on a new platform than before. While I set up super chats, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, I'm Travis Dumsday. I teach philosophy at Concordia University of Edmonton, which is in northwestern Canada.
Nice. Northwest. So, what time is it over there?
7 o'clock.
7. Okay, so you're just a couple of hours. That's like mountain time in the U.S.
That's it. Yep.
Okay, cool. So not too bad. Hang on one second. But yeah, you were on when it was just a podcast. Maybe how long ago was that? The last time you were on, do you think?
Well, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago.
That long ago?
I think so.
Maybe it was couldn't be that long ago. But you were on. We talked about transhumanism. But maybe it was definitely probably yeah, maybe a year ago. Maybe a yearish, maybe. So but anyways, we are going to continue that topic. I did read I took the time to read your essay, your journal. What's the proper word for that? It's an academic journal, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So I did read that, and it was interesting. I never actually heard of Fedorov. I never heard of Fedorov before, which is weird because he's a contemporary of people that I have read and I'm pretty familiar with. But you recently wrote this piece called Sergius Bulgakov's Critique of N.F. Fedorov, Technologized Resurrection, and Why It Still Matters for the Christian Dialogue with Transhumanism. So if you could, who was Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov, and what were his ideas related to defeating death with technology?
Sure. Yeah. So Nikolai Fedorov he was born in, I think it's around 1829, 1830, and died a few years into the 20th century, I think around 1903. And Fedorov, for most of his working life, was a librarian at one of the big sort of academic research libraries in Moscow. And he kind of lived I'm not sure what the right label would be. Maybe there's a Russian term for it, but he kind of lived a life of something approaching a kind of lay monastic. He had a very ascetic lifestyle. He was a very serious Christian, and in sort of his private hours, did a lot of researching and writing his own philosophical and theological works. And some of these started to circulate privately amongst the various intellectuals that he got to know, partly through his work at the library. And so even though during his life he wasn't really publishing much, his ideas started to spread pretty widely, and he started to become quite well known. And so his ideas were being actively discussed by people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Soloviev. Some of the leading sort of figures of Russian intelligentsia were interested in Fedorov's ideas. And then after he died, a few years after he died, his friends collected together and edited these copious manuscript notes that he had left behind. And so a few years after his death, they published his major work, which was titled The Philosophy of the Common Task. And the philosophy of the common task is really all about Fedorov's sort of grand project or grand vision for where human history needs to be heading. And the common task he's referring to is this great project of human beings conquering death through the use of technology. And when he talks about conquering death, he means like absolute victory over mortality. So coming up with technological innovations that will stop people from dying. So will eliminate death for those who are currently alive, and will also allow us to resurrect our dead ancestors. Not just recently dead ancestors, but everybody. And so it's pictured as this complete victory over death, but through technology, right? And so this is, the paper sort of delves into how some of this fits into contemporary discussions of things like, transhumanism, where this idea of victory over death through technological means is also a prominent notion. One of the interesting things about Fedorov, though, was that he was putting forward this notion of technological victory over death from within a Christian framework. So his idea was that God's original intent was that there would not be death, but there was the fall. So humans, through their sin, introduced mortality into the world and lost control over nature. Right? God originally intended that human beings would have sort of control over the laws of nature. So when we fell, we became subject to death, and we became subject to the blind forces of nature, no longer under our control. And so part of the redemptive plan is for human beings to, regain our pre-fallen state through technology. And so this is a process, according to Fedorov, that it all fits within divine providence, right? So Fedorov still believes in, the Christian eschatology, right? That this Christian vision of the end of the world and the resurrection of the dead. It's just, for him, it's not going to be accomplished through a divine miracle, right? God is not going to step in and, intervene miraculously to resurrect the dead. Rather, God has delegated that task to human beings. And so for Fedorov, there needs to be a radical reordering and restructuring of human society and human politics, all ordered towards this grand common task, right? This grand vision of the defeat of death.
Interesting. I mean, it seems almost, so he was, I guess, considered himself Orthodox, correct? I have this, I'm like, but didn't Christ conquer death by death? I just don't understand how he can come to these conclusions. What was it that, is there any indication where he got some of these ideas?
Well, certainly Fedorov does make use of scriptures, but I don't see any indication in his work that he is, making the bold claim that this is somehow explicitly laid out in scripture. He's not claiming that. I think his idea is that this is sort of implicit in the larger scriptural and orthodox vision of humanity and God's intentions for humanity. So yeah, I don't think he's not claiming to ground this explicitly in the Bible. He's not claiming there's anything in Scripture that indicates that God is, giving us an 11th commandment: use technology to conquer death. But I think he is taking it to be implicit in the kind of theological worldview that's being laid out in the Scripture and the tradition.
Yeah. I mean, and I have noticed some interesting parallels between what transhumanism is. Well, I think you even talk about this in your essay. What transhumanism is trying to accomplish via technology and human means is there's some parallels to what we are trying to accomplish through orthodoxy, through the aesthetic life and Orthodox spirituality. but I guess you could compare that to like a Tower of Babel sort of thing. But so what was Sergius? I know Sergius Bulgakov, who was a prominent theologian, and I think a contemporary, correct? Um, what were his main criticisms of Fedorov?
Yeah, so well, just for some of your viewers who might not be familiar with Bulgakov, maybe I'll just say a couple of quick things by way
Okay.
of introducing him. So, yeah, he is his dates do partially overlap with Fedorov. So again, Fedorov is around 1830 to 1903, I believe, and Bulgakov is 1871 to 1944. Now, Bulgakov was the son of a priest. He came from a long line of Orthodox clergy. But as a young man, he sort of became secularized, as many people in Russia did at the time, as many educated people in Russia did at the time. So for a while, he became a Marxist, and then he saw the light, turned back to Christianity, converted. I think his conversion came around. I should have double checked these dates. I think his conversion back to Christianity was around 1908. Happened in this remote hermitage that he had gone to. So he converted back to Christianity, and then about 10 years later was ordained a priest. He had become, by that time, he had gotten his doctorate, so he was teaching political economy, I think it was, at one of the major Russian universities. Then, with the Russian Revolution, obviously Christian intellectuals, had a hard time of it. So Bulgakov, as you know, there are like different waves of persecution in Russia when it comes to persecuting religious believers. In the early period, so Bulgakov was exiled around, I think it was 1922 or 1923, and that was early on. It was early enough in Soviet history that the party was still kind of worried about negative press coverage. So at that point, at least when it came to, public intellectuals who were internationally known, at that point anyway, Lenin and Trotsky, their preferred strategy was exile instead of execution. And so there were these great waves of Russian intellectuals who were exiled to other parts of Europe. And so Bulgakov, when he left, I think he spent a little bit of time in Turkey and then went to Paris. And at Paris, he started teaching at I think at that time, relatively newly founded sort of Orthodox Theological College in Paris, the Institute of St. Sergius. So Bulgakov became the dean eventually of St. Sergius, and basically worked as a theologian and priest until his death in 1944. And his discussion of Fedorov, or at least the discussion of Fedorov that I'm familiar with, Bulgakov has a very large body of work. I haven't read all of it. Not all of it's been translated into English. So there might be other discussions of Fedorov that I've just completely missed. But the discussion, his critique of Fedorov, the one that I'm dealing with in this particular journal article, appears in Bulgakov's sort of first really major theological work, which is called the Unfading Light, which was published in Russia in 1917, and then was translated into English around 90 years later, sort of early 2010s, I think, is when the translation was done. So it's a fairly recent translation. And so at that point, in 1917, Fedorov had only been dead for about 15 years. And so his ideas were still very much kind of in the air, under active discussion. It was still of interest to other Russian intellectuals at the time. And so Bulgakov spends around, I think it's about 5 to 10 pages of Unfading Light talking about Fedorov's this book, The Philosophy of the Common Task, and critiquing it. And it is both. So Bulgakov has a high regard for Fedorov as a Christian, right? He accepts that Fedorov was a sincere Orthodox Christian, and was motivated by sincere Christian beliefs. So Bulgakov, in some ways, his critique is pretty mild, right? He's not accusing Fedorov of like outright heresy, but although he doesn't say that explicitly, I think it comes out in some of his critical comments that he thinks Fedorov's ideas are pretty wide of the mark and do actually conflict, both with what scriptures say and what the Orthodox tradition has to say about the nature of the human person, the nature of life and death, and what the biblical vision for bodily resurrection is supposed to be. Anyway, so that's just background about sort of who Bulgakov was, when he came out with this critique of Fedorov, and yeah, sort of what the context was. Yeah, any questions or thoughts on that before I get into the critique itself?
No. Well, I always find it curious that Bulgakov. I didn't even know he was a priest. I never see father before his name anywhere. Is there a reason for that, or?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I should mention that although Bulgakov is, I think it would be uncontroversial to say that he's one of the most influential Orthodox theologians, especially Russian Orthodox theologians of the last 100 years. Everybody agrees on his his importance to Orthodox thought, but within contemporary Orthodox sort of scholarship and sort of the contemporary Orthodox theological world, Bulgakov's not thought of as highly as he used to be. But moreover, even in his own lifetime, Bulgakov's works were quite controversial. So some aspects of Bulgakov's sort of theological system were condemned by both the Moscow Patriarchate and the what became the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. But he also had his defenders. But anyway, he's a controversial figure, and he was a controversial figure in his own lifetime. He remains a controversial figure today in Orthodox thought. But he's still really prominent. He's still really important. He still certainly does have supporters both within Orthodoxy, and also he gets a lot of attention from certain circles within Roman Catholic and Anglo-Catholic theological. I don't want to say the word circles again. Theological scenes. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I have heard I've heard that there was some sort of controversy. Actually, I read one of his books, which was like just an intro to Orthodoxy book, very basic, and I didn't see anything that or alerted any red flags to me. And then I think I suggested the book to somebody once, and they were like, "Oh well, they seemed a little off put by him," and I'm like, "What's wrong with him?" But I guess I never dove too far deeper into what the controversies were, so I'll just, I guess, remain oblivious for now. But what were his? I guess let's dive into what were his actual. What's the meat of his objections to Fedorov's ideas?
Right. So first off, Fedorov was very confident that in order to bring back the dead, we really just need to come up with a technological way of reconstituting like the matter and the material structure that originally composed, our dead ancestors. And Fedorov grants that might initially seem really implausible, right? Think of all the people who've died over the millennia, and all the ways in which their material constituents have been scattered throughout the Earth and the wider solar system and whatever. But Fedorov says, look, the cosmos is finite. There's only a finite amount of matter around. There's no way we could know that this technological project is impossible. So let's assume that it's possible, right? Because if we really love our dead ancestors, we're going to want to bring them back. And the only reason this isn't, the dominant goal of human society is our lack of love. And if we truly had a Christ-like love both for the living and the dead, it would recognize that the necessity of doing this, the necessity and the practical possibility, right, of doing this. We wouldn't be so pessimistic, in other words, if we just loved more, right? We would take the chances involved. Anyway, so Fedorov is quite optimistic that if we can just bring people's material parts back together again and restructure them in certain ways, and use technological means and maybe hidden cosmic forces that we haven't uncovered yet, I don't understand yet, if we can just put all this into practice and figure it out, use science to figure it out, then we can actually make this work. Now, one of Bulgakov's criticisms is that this really is just impossible, right? Because the human person is a union of body and immaterial spirit. And so it doesn't matter what you do fiddling around with, even if somehow you were able to bring back together all the physical atoms that composed your dead ancestors and restructure them in a certain way, that's not going to call the spirit back into the body. That's not something that could possibly be under human control. That's solely under God's control. So that was one of his criticisms, right? That Fedorov had not taken into account in sufficient detail, the full orthodox picture of the human person and how the human person is sort of constituted out of these sort of metaphysical parts. That was one criticism. Another criticism was that even if you could do this, even if somehow so again, he thinks it's impossible that we could use technology to force the soul back into the body, right, into its corpse. He thinks that's impossible, but he also says, okay, grant for the sake of argument that it is possible. What kind of body is it going to be coming back to? Well, it's going to be coming back to a body which is basically of the same type as the body that originally died. And that's not the biblical picture of what the resurrection of the dead is going to look like. The biblical picture of resurrection is the resurrection of a transfigured body, right? A body that's been transfigured by God's uncreated grace, right? And a body that can never die because it's so imbued with these divine energies. A deified resurrected body, in other words. So that Bulgakov says, that's the standard picture of how resurrection is going to work. Moreover, it's going to be that those divine energies that ensure that we can never again die. It's not going to be some technological means that guarantee that we death is permanently banished. Bulgakov also raises some concerns that, again, he fully acknowledges that Fedorov's a sincere Christian, and Fedorov did not intend to sort of lead his readers into weird directions. But part of Bulgakov's critique also involves sort of some hints that he's worried that Fedorov is unwittingly kind of getting into some borderline sort of occult streams of thought. and ideas like necromancy and things like this, right? Because the sort of hidden cosmic forces that Fedorov talks about in his works. Bulgakov seems to think these are unlikely to be scientifically, respectable kind of forces that are ultimately going to have to be put into play here. And so part of Bulgakov's worry seems to be that once Fedorov starts playing around with this idea of using technology to resurrect the dead, what that's going to lead people into eventually is this idea that maybe they're going to start flirting with the notion of using non-technological methods of bringing back the dead, which are sort of even worse from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, I think you get into. I mean, I don't know if this is for later in the conversation, but you kind of explain how you could see. I don't know if you were explaining Bulgakov's position or if it was yours, but
That was
well,
Bulgakov.
yeah, I guess it was
Yeah.
Bulgakov. Yeah, about it, how it could just delve into, like once they realize the science doesn't work, it could just devolve into occult, just occultism, like alchemy and that type of thing.
Yeah, well,
So,
the way he
well,
puts
not
it,
that alchemy would apply to this, but
yeah, I'd have to look up the specific passage again, but I think the wording is something like, Bulgakov says something like, that Fedorov's vision is going to end up looking more like theurgy, like magic essentially, rather than science or technology.
yeah. So how is this all relevant to dialogue between Christianity and the modern transhumanist movement? How is this related?
Sure. Well, so with this new platform you've got, have you recently had discussions of transhumanism? Like, should I sort of go over briefly
I
what
actually
that is?
haven't. I haven't. So the last I mean Jay Dyer may have mentioned it briefly when he was talking about the global reset thing. So yeah, maybe a rehash. What is transhumanism? That's maybe we should do
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Jay does talk about transhumanism in some of his uh,
Yeah,
some of the
he
broadcasts and
was
stuff he's done.
he just mentioned the like the Klaus Schwab hooking her brains up and uploading it into some sort of server of some sort. So
Yeah. Well, so transhuman, that is one of the ideas that comes up a lot in contemporary transhumanism. Well, uh, the basic idea of transhumanism is this notion of using advancements in science and technology to basically take us as a species to the next level, like to sort of transcend our humanity, right? To move beyond our humanity. What exactly does that mean? Well, this is where you get some different versions of transhumanism, right? And some different ideas about how this should be achieved. So some folks writing under the transhumanist kind of label, um, their vision is, what we need to do is use things like genetic engineering to start to take evolution from being a random process to something we are consciously directing and controlling. And so using genetic engineering to basically evolve the human species using genetic technology into something better and something more, to sort of go beyond our humanity in that sense. Make us into a new species, a better species. What exactly does that look like? Well, again, that looks different on some different thinkers, sort of fully fleshed out pictures of this. But it's things like, genetically engineering people to have far higher IQs or very different sort of physical capacities, or even in some of the borderline sci-fi stuff, like, you know, giving us wings or letting us breathe underwater, or sort of really more extreme forms of genetic engineering like that, or splicing human genome with animal genomes in various ways. That's one version of transhumanism. Another commonly discussed version is sort of the one you were just mentioning, right? Where the idea is we're going to transcend humanity by literally transcending our biology completely. Right? And the way to do this, in the view of people like Ray Kurzweil, he's probably the most prominent transhumanist to plug this version of the view. That basically we can develop our technology to the point where we can upload human consciousness onto a computer network and enjoy a kind of digital immortality entirely separate from the biological frame. So that'll be another sort of version of transhumanism, right, where we just go beyond the biology completely. Yeah, there's some other versions. I mean, cybernetics sometimes comes up as another way we might sort of transcend our humanity. Nanotechnology, drugs, various pharmacological means of enhancing human abilities. So there's a few, there's a few other concepts that sort of are frequently tied in together with transhumanism, like artificial human enhancement, genetic engineering, eugenics. There are some differences between them, but they all kind of feed in various ways into the transhumanist movement. Most self-identified transhumanists, I would say, are secularists, and so the sort of the vision of human immortality you get in someone like Ray Kurzweil is very much a secular version of immortality, right? Again, you're transferring human consciousness into a computer, and you're really safeguarding that computer technology so it can't crash or whatever. But there are also some religious transhumanists as well. And Fedorov occasionally shows up in some of the works of both secular and religious transhumanists. Anyway, so that's sorry, I maybe went on there a bit too long, but for those who are not familiar with the term, that's sort of the basic idea of what transhumanism is all about.
Okay, that was good. So how does it? So was Fedorov? I mean, was it even really a concept when he was around, or did he kind of is he a big influence on the idea?
Well, yeah. So folks who sort of work on like the history of transhumanism often do cite Fedorov as one of like the earliest people you could plausibly label a transhumanist, a Christian transhumanist, but a transhumanist nonetheless. So, for example, there's a theologian, Michael Burdett. So in his book on transhumanism, he talks about Fedorov as one of like the really early people who can be listed. He's certainly very influential he remains very influential in Russian transhumanism, as you'd expect. He's not as well known in sort of the English-speaking world, but yeah, there are certainly some folks who are aware of his ideas and some of the influence he's had on other thinkers.
Okay. Yeah. So I know you mentioned what are some of your predictions? I guess this might be the better question, anyways. What are your predictions with where the transhumanist movement will end up? I know you also mentioned that the NDEs, the after death experiences, before people are resuscitated, as kind of anecdotal evidence, but it might turn into actually solidified science in the future. That there is an experience of that your soul can live separate from your body. Could you get into kind of that, and where do you see, or some possible scenarios of where this movement actually goes and its interplay with Christianity?
Sure, yeah. So in this article, it's kind of divided up into a few parts where the opening portions of the paper, I'm just summarizing, Fedorov's ideas on technologized resurrection and then summarizing Bulgakov's critique. And I think all of that's pretty uncontroversial. Like, I think if I'm certainly not an expert in Bulgakov or in Fedorov, but I'm pretty confident that if experts on their thought were to read those first sections of the paper, I don't think there's anything in there they'd find particularly contentious. I'm just sort of summarizing what's going on in some fairly unambiguous texts. So those first couple of portions of the paper, I think, are uncontentious. The third section of the paper, though, is where I'm getting into the contemporary relevance of their dialogue, right? Their contemporary relevance of this discussion that went on between Fedorov and Bulgakov. And it's that section of the paper I get into some pretty weird, controversial stuff where, in retrospect, I'm actually a little surprised that the paper got published where it did, because it got published in a journal called Zygon, which is, a pretty prominent venue for sort of work in theology and science. And I was kind of concerned that they would reject the paper as just being too weird. But to my surprise and delight, they accepted it. And by the way, I think that the article itself is behind a paywall, but if any of your viewers are interested in reading the article, they can just email me and I'll send it to them. Anyway, in the third section of this article, what I'm doing is trying to argue for the contemporary relevance of this. And basically what I argue is the following. Science is rapidly heading in a couple of different directions. One of these directions is going to be the failure of the secular transhumanist project. So folks like Ray Kurzweil and others who have this vision of transferring human consciousness onto computer mainframes or things like this, that's going to fail. That's my confident empirical prediction. Likewise, Fedorov's program of somehow, bringing back the dead using other technological means, likewise, I would say this is just impossible for similar reasons that Bulgakov listed. So not just the technological implausibility of it, but the theological issues involved. I think this isn't going to happen. Okay, so on the one side then, we've got the the upcoming failure of the transhumanist project of, victory over mortality through human technology. When's that going to come about? When will transhumanists realize this isn't going to work? I don't know, maybe a generation, 2 generations, as, computer technology gets better and better, and our neuroscience gets better and better. Eventually they're going to realize that project is just going to fail. At the same time, there's another scientific development going on that I imprudently, very confidently predict is also going to come to pass within a generation or two. Namely, that empirical science is going to establish with a very high degree of confidence that human consciousness survives the death of the body. And so part of what I do in that last section of the paper is talk about some of my reasons for thinking this. And my main reason for thinking this is just the rapidly improving medical research into near-death experiences. So most of your viewers are probably familiar with these. This is when someone, it's this interesting phenomenon of when someone is clinically dead and then revived. A certain percentage of the time, they will have memories of certain sorts of experiences that occurred to them while they were clinically dead. So stereotypically, things like floating above their body and watching themselves being worked on by the doctors, and then going through this dark tunnel and maybe seeing a bright light or encountering dead loved ones, and eventually being sent back to the body. That's sort of the rough idea of a near-death experience. Now, near-death experiences have become, have gone from being unbelievably rare to unbelievably common, right? Ever since the CPR revolution of the 1960s, with these massive advancements in resuscitation techniques, you went from hardly anybody ever being brought back from clinical death to, hundreds of thousands being brought back from clinical death every year, probably millions. I have to check the numbers. And so near-death experiences have become unbelievably common. And moreover, unlike most topic areas in, I don't know, what might be called like parapsychology or paranormal research, near-death experiences are comparatively respectable. There's a lot of prominent people working on them, and in part that's because near-death experiences are largely of interest to medical doctors and people working in the medical field. And just as a sociological matter, nobody has more respect in our culture than medical doctors. And so if medical doctors are interested in a certain phenomenon, people will grant the phenomenon is less likely to be pure quackery. Anyway, so there's lots of high quality work being done on near-death experiences by prominent qualified medical researchers. And some of this research is, achieving very interesting results. In particular, some of this research is looking into verifying the accuracy of what these clinically dead people report seeing while they're clinically dead. Right. So in other words, some of this research is looking into verifying that, when they're floating above their body, allegedly looking at what's happening in the operating room or at the crash site or wherever it is they've been brought to clinical death, trying to determine that what they're actually seeing is accurate and verifiable. And it used to be that, that was done largely just through anecdotes and trying to verify sort of after the fact, anecdotally that what they were seeing was real. Not actually by itself came up with some fairly good evidence. What's being done now, though, is prospective studies designed to test for this in a much more sophisticated way. And so I spend a good chunk of that portion of the paper in particular discussing the work of Sam Parnia. If listeners are interested, the name is Sam Parnia, Parnia. And the study he did recently was called the AWARE study, where basically what they did was in ambulances and operating rooms and areas where people are often subject to clinical death, and they just put up these objects, signs and things like this that would be visible from the ceiling but not visible from the ground. And these are designed to then test, so that way if someone clinically dies and reports seeing stuff while they're clinically dead, looking down from the ceiling or whatever, will they see the newspaper headline or the number or whatever it is that's been put up in this area of the ceiling that's only visible from the ceiling? That provides a way of testing the accuracy of what people are reporting in these near-death experiences. Now, Parnia's study did have some positive results, but not as substantial as you'd hope to see. It wasn't a large enough study. It wasn't didn't go on long enough. There were some parameters that needed to be improved, but this is exactly the kind of research that is needed to try to figure out, well, can the human consciousness exist outside the physical frame? If this kind of research continues and gets better and starts achieving consistent positive results, what we will then have is pretty solid empirical confirmation that human consciousness can exist, at least for a while, separately from the human brain. And some kind of life after death is real. Okay, so how does this connect back to the first idea I was talking about, right? This failure of the transhumanist project of uploading human consciousness into computers or other ways of beating mortality. So my claim is that within a generation or two, we're going to have two interesting new developments. One interesting development is the failure of the transhumanist project. The other interesting development is empirical proof, or at least functional proof, as good as scientific proof gets, of life after death. So with those two twin things in mind, what's going to happen with the transhumanist project? Will the discovery that human consciousness does in fact exist separately from the brain, will that discourage further pursuit of the transhumanist project, and trying to harness that consciousness and direct it using technology? Or will it encourage them to pursue it further? Try to find some way of capturing or redirecting the human consciousness once it's outside of the brain. My guess is that for most secular transhumanists, it's going to be the second, right? They're actually going to be motivated to get even deeper into this kind of work once they realize that the consciousness can exist separately from the body. They're going to try to figure out ways of using technology to appropriate this process and control what happens to the consciousness after death. Because why wouldn't you, right? If you're a secularist, but you've discovered that the consciousness has some kind of at least temporary existence after bodily death, why wouldn't you try to control that using technical means? And so that's going to give a boost to the transhumanist project. They're going to keep trying to work at this. But once again, they're going to realize that standard nuts and bolts technology isn't going to do it. So does that mean they give up entirely? Or does that mean they start using non-technological means of trying to control what happens to human consciousness after death? My guess is that for a lot of folks working on this, that's going to seem pretty tempting. Right? And so that's the connection with Bulgakov. Right? Bulgakov was worried that if people pursued Fedorov's project, the failure of technical methods is going to make them more tempted towards non-technological methods of controlling death. Theurgy, right? Occultism. And I think that's where transhumanism as a contemporary movement is headed. I think Bulgakov, at least in embryo, saw this, saw the potential for this, right? That the transhumanist attempt to control death using technology will, once science shows that human consciousness can exist outside the brain, at least for a little while, transhumanism is going to take a much darker, weirder turn. And they're going to start using non-technological means to achieve their ends of controlling, controlling human mortality, or maybe some even more bizarre amalgam of, technological means and occultism. So that's my pessimistic prediction for where secular transhumanism is headed in the next 60 years or so.
Yeah. So, I mean, this might be the most juicy question. Anyways, well, I mean, with that in mind, with it still moving forward, who are some of the biggest players in the modern transhumanist movement? Are they influential on global policy, and is there any connection to, I guess, globalism and the Great Reset, as people like Jay Dyer imply?
Not that I've seen. I mean, not that I know very much about. I mean, I know the term Great Reset, and I know a little bit about what's come up recently in the Canadian popular media on these terms. Thanks to some comments from our Prime Minister. I've seen some discussions in the literature on transhumanism about some of these alleged connections. And certainly, there are some important people in the world of Silicon Valley, including Ray Kurzweil, who have kind of connections to politics and other forms of industry, and all that said, I've not come across anything that I see as very convincing that would show me that there's some kind of deep link between the transhumanist agenda and any major, political movement or ideology. Yeah, there might eventually be such connections forged, but I've not seen anything that really would convince me of that at the moment.
Well, that's a what we would call a white pill. I mean, that's good. I think the only thing I've actually seen is the Klaus Schwab stuff with the. I don't even know if it was him, but part of the whole Great Reset movement stuff. I think that's a part of it, but they don't seem to imply that it's anywhere in the near future with it. So it's not like imminent. I don't think they even bring it up as imminent. I think it's in their kind of their long term that plan. What about I know Peter Craig Andrew Charleston says Peter Thiel is a biggie, but he's a Trump supporter. um, I think who else? What's the Tesla guy? He's big in? Doesn't he have some sort of aspirations for this as well?
Well, certainly there are some very wealthy people who are very interested in things like radical life extension and, trying to use technological means to at least delay death for a really long period of time. Because if you've got a ton of money, that would seem like a good use of it, right? If you've got a ton of money and you're a secularist, what better way to spend your money than try to extend your life? And certainly there are connections between like the radical life extension sort of movement and the transhumanist movement. So inevitably there will be some connections between like the ultra wealthy radical life extension and transhumanism. There are going to be some of those connections, but I guess what I meant was I don't see the kind of more. So there are some folks who suggest like a more intentional, planned, nefarious kind of connection between transhumanism and, again, various political movements or ideologies in like a more organized, sort of hidden kind of way. That's what I'm more skeptical of. I certainly grant that there are some very wealthy, influential people who are interested in transhumanism and interested in radical life extension. I think that's uncontroversial. It's the more, the alleged sort of more conspiratorial links, I think, are what remain to be. I just haven't really seen very good evidence for that.
Yeah, Craig Charleston keeps mentioning properly called technocracy, and very enthusiastic. Started in 1931. Do you know anything about that as a term specifically? I've
Not
heard of
really.
it.
Yeah, no, I mean, like as an ideology, technocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like a play on oligarchy or plutocracy, where we're getting ruled by the technocrats. So,
Uh,
yeah. Which, I mean, I guess it could be. I would imagine that technology will be utilized as a means of control in a totalitarian system. I would imagine that. I mean, you see it in China too. So, I mean, the question is, how are they going to use it? Transhumanism doesn't necessarily mean align with surveillance technology either. Those are two different things, I think, right? Is there any link between that?
well, I'm sure there are individual transhumanists who are, um, publicly plugged for particular political ideologies, but I don't see any really deep conceptual connection between the transhumanist project and, say, like socialism versus libertarianism. I mean, I don't see why someone couldn't be a transhumanist and a libertarian, or a transhumanist and a socialist, or anything in between. Um, I mean, I'm open to considering that there might be some conceptual linkages there that I'm missing, but yeah, I would need to see some arguments for why a transhumanist would be more likely to lean in a certain direction versus another when it comes to political ideologies.
We have a Dune reference. I'm always going to put a Dune reference on the screen. So I don't know. I don't know why. I just like Dune. Which is probably has why I'm interested in weird conversations like this. So um,
I've never read the Frank Herbert books, but I watched the David Lynch movie
oh
a couple of
god,
months ago. I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I hope that's not an accurate sort
no,
of
the movie.
rendition of.
It's not. It's actually the movie's. It's probably the worst interpretation of a book that I've ever seen.
Oh,
Yeah, so you probably want to read. I've only read the first one. I haven't read the whole series, but it is very one of my favorite sci-fis. I should finish the series at some point, but yeah. Are you into science fiction?
not really. No,
No, no.
no. I've watched it mostly because I like David Lynch, and it was on one of the streaming services.
It's bad. It's really rough. No, you should read the book. It's I think Frank Herbert kind of went in a direction that he didn't expect. He was I guess initially trying to be critical of the quote unquote strong man of history, and then ended up kind of embracing it as he was writing. So it's interesting. So I like Dune. I need to finish it, but let's see. There was something else that was on my head before I got distracted by Dune. Alex, why? Before you, um, can't remember what I actually was going to say. Totally slipped my. Now I'm thinking about science fiction. But anyways, any final thoughts to kind of oh, I know what I wanted to. I know that you kind of mentioned that socialist paradigm and like the libertarian different kind of political theories. I think if you look this Great Reset thing, I don't think it really fits any of that. I don't think it's not actually socialism, nor is it capitalism as we kind of would think of it. They call it stakeholder capitalism, but it really does seem to have like all the worst qualities of all of them, kind of mushed together. So I would actually be interested to see your take if you looked into it, but I don't think there's necessarily a direct correlation between that and I guess mainstream transhumanism. The only thing I've seen is the consciousness uplink, basically. So maybe it's a troll. I don't know. Let's see. Joe says, "Wouldn't a chip in the brain or something be pretty anti-libertarian?" Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily a transhumanist thing as much as it is just a surveillance technology.
Well, it depends what the chip is doing and who puts it in, right? So I can imagine a good, solid libertarian transhumanist saying that, look, if I want to put a chip in my brain that's going to, decrease my aggression and increase my benevolence, or a chip in the brain that's going to boost my IQ by 50 points, who is the government to tell me that I can't do that, right? Anything that I do to my own body should be perfectly legal as long as it's not directly harming anyone else. So libertarian, I could easily imagine, libertarian transhumanist, I could easily imagine wanting to fill his brain with all kinds of interesting chips as long as they saw them as being advantageous in some way.
Let's see. Craig Charleston says the Great Reset equals technocracy. Honestly, Craig, I think Jay Dyer knows a heck of a lot more about this than I do. I did an episode on it, but I was just reading straight off of their website, and that sounded bad enough for me not to like it. So I'm just reading Klaus Schwab's own words. I did not like what I was reading. Transhumanism is just another snare to lose souls, just like aliens, another means to destroy weak faiths. I mean, that's probably accurate. It's just kind of a an ideology that keeps people away from the true faith, right?
It's funny that the aliens come up. One of the things we didn't really get into is so Fedorov, when Fedorov was proposing this universal technologized resurrection, right, bringing all the dead back. Of course, he realized that planet Earth wouldn't have enough space for, all these billions upon billions of dead ancestors. And so Fedorov said, well, what that implies is that God also intended us to colonize all the other planets. And so part of Fedorov's sort of eschatological vision, it's not just bringing back the dead, it's colonizing space. And using science and technology to do that as well.
Interesting. We'll do one last question. Let's see. Joe asks, do you think the new psychedelic push is related to transhumanism? I think maybe he's talking about like the Joe Rogan stuff with the that I don't pay too much attention to the psychedelic stuff, so I don't even know what he's referencing.
Well, in the transhumanist literature, again, I'd have to look into this as well, but in the transhumanist literature, you do sometimes come across discussions of using pharmaceuticals, again, to enhance human beings in various ways. Right? So, for example, if you could come up with, so one of the ways you could improve humanity would be using genetic engineering to maybe eliminate certain negative personality traits or give us certain physical enhancements. Another way you might be able to do that is through drugs, right? So imagine you could take a drug that would lower human aggression by like 90%, or increase some of your virtues by 90%. Would it be okay to take the drug? Would it be obligatory to take the drug? Imagine we had a drug that would really boost your humility and benevolence and generosity. Why not take the drug? What are you missing by? Anyway, those are some of the kinds of points that come up in the radical human enhancement literature, where there's pretty thin borderline between that and the transhumanism stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, yeah. Well, any final comments just to kind of tie everything together, and where you mentioned people can email you, how to get your access, I guess, to get access to your stuff. How can they do that?
Sure. Well, my email address is a bit long and unwieldy, so maybe just Google my name, and that should bring up my university webpage pretty quickly, and you can get my email through that.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, any other final points?
No, not really. It's fun to talk about transhumanism. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and share some thoughts about it. I think it will, within the next couple of generations, this is going to become less academic and more sort of practically significant. So it's worth talking about this stuff now before it becomes sort of really pressing.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's terrifying, but I don't like messing with the human experience in the way that they're trying to mess with it. So, but I do like this comment here before we go. Kay Healer, the psychedelic push is just an easy backdoor to demonic possession. An Orthodox Christian should be alert and discerning at all times, not on drugs. I agree. We should be discerning of all of these things. So, but yeah, soy lattes are probably worse. So anyhow, I appreciate you coming back on, Professor. I hope to have you back on in the future. And for those watching, I appreciate you tuning in. And I will be back on Thursday evening with Stephen Ignoramus, I think is his name. So he has a good little channel on YouTube too, but we're just going to be covering current events. We don't even have a real topic lined up yet. It's because everything is in flux with the politics. So, but thank you once again, and I will see you all on Thursday.